Ready? Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we are joined by a very special guest, Mr. Luke Hall. Hi Luke, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming and speaking with us today. How are you?
I'm good, thanks Ash. Thank you for having me, man. Looking forward to diving into some nice topics about nutrition.
Absolutely. And for people who might not be familiar with you yet, could you give us a quick intro on your background? How did you get into nutrition and sort of what areas of nutrition do you specialize in?
Ace. Yeah, so my background currently, we'll go with that. I'm currently a performance nutritionist working for PH Nutrition. So I know you've had Liam on before, so working with Liam from PH. I got into nutrition, I kind of went the long way round, really. So my first degree, I went to university and I was good at physics. So when I left sixth form, everyone was saying, just do what you're good at. So I did physics. And then 2 years into that, I realized that, hey, I don't necessarily care about the wider world. I care much more about, hey, what's going on in my body, what's going on in everyone else's body. So I became a strength and conditioning coach when I was at uni as well. And from there, I realized that, hey, my passions are actually more in the nutrition side of things, the nutrition side of human performance as opposed to training. Don't get me wrong, I love training. But in terms of that side of things, it was like nutrition just kind of dragged me over. So after I finished my bachelor's in physics, somehow I wangled my way onto a master's in human nutrition with a physics background. I still don't know how I did that. But yeah, I must have really charmed the admissions officer, did that and then haven't looked back. So since then, I've kind of specialized more in sports nutrition. So I've done a couple of qualifications for the International Society of Sports Nutrition and all that sort of stuff. And then now, yeah, just working with primarily CrossFit athletes and then some endurance athletes as well. So more the ultra endurance side of things, just because it absolutely fascinates me in terms of what we can actually do, just the human body, what it's actually capable of in terms of pushing yourself to those absolute limits. And it's a lot more challenging from a nutrition side of things. There's a lot more obstacles that we have to overcome. And so that is, to me anyway, kind of really exhilarates me more than just dealing with general population wanting to get in shape, fat loss. Don't get me wrong, love doing that, love having the impact on people and helping people do that, but just it gets me razzed up to try and troubleshoot the endurance side of things and work away around some problems there. So
amazing. Is that your personal sort of training preference as well, like going from strength and conditioning into endurance? What's your journey been like there?
It's become more so recently. So I actually, when I was, believe it or not, I'm 5'7", and at school I played basketball. So 5'7" basketball, and I love that. I love the power, the speed, that sort of stuff. But then I came to university and realized I was not gonna, get very far in a basketball career when I'm 5'7". Like 3-pointers can only get you so far. So I actually picked up Olympic weightlifting. So started doing Olympic weightlifting because short levers, fantastic. And then realized that, hey, doing one lift, then waiting 5 minutes to do another lift isn't necessarily as stimulating for my brain as basketball was or anything like that. So then I kind of fell into CrossFit. I've been doing CrossFit for a couple of years, probably more like 4 years now, actually, which has flown by. But then very recently, kind of in the past year or so, I have started to move more towards that endurance side of things and more hybrid. So, you see guys like Fergus Crawley that are running marathons, running 5-minute miles and squatting their like 200 kilo squat or whatever it was that he did. And it's like that kind of thing where, okay, how far can I push my own limits of my body in each different direction? And for me, the kind of endurance side was probably what was lacking the most. So I've dived into that kind of within the past 6 months or so, semi-COVID forced, because I've got no weights at home, but I've been absolutely loving it and kind of using the stuff that I've learned before in terms of endurance physiology and applying that has been massively kind of just not eye-opening because I knew it, but it's been awesome to just use that and go through that process. And I never thought when I was playing basketball or Olympic weightlifting that I'd be the kind of guy that would just go for like a 20-mile run or whatever. Now I'm sat there thinking, that sounds ace.
On that, how have you found trying to combine the two? Because personally, I've really struggled to combine, like, say, strength training per se with, the trying to get better in the endurance world, because they're, even though they complement each other to some respect, they really don't. They're so far from each other. And where my biggest struggle I found is not that you can't necessarily do it, but it's more the recovery side of things. So I guess obviously we can kind of touch on some of that stuff today with like the nutrition stuff, but I've personally found like the actual physical side of recovering from sessions and like day-to-day life has been one of the hardest bit for me. How have you found kind of combining the two, and have you managed to, optimize your recovery so far?
Yeah, so in all honesty, for me, I haven't been going kind of full in on both. So when I started prioritizing endurance training, I just reduced the volume and the intensity of kind of like my resistance training, basically, and the intensity of metcons that I was hitting and all that sort of stuff, just to kind of, it's, as you say, it's very hard to get those two things to marry each other, especially when you think about, like concurrent training and how they literally butt heads in terms of the adaptations you want to achieve. So for me, it was like, okay, I need to actually look at, hey, what is the thing that I potentially need to improve on the most? And because of my years in Olympic weightlifting, it was like endurance. So for me, it's basically just been doing that kind of cost benefit analysis of, if I take my endurance training up, then the resistance training is probably going to have to come down a bit, and more sort of focus there on not entirely improving in resistance training, but just maintaining what I have. And so for me, I've been trying to do a lot more kind of low load resistance stuff, and used a bit of blood flow restriction and that sort of stuff to get around it.
I love it. Yeah.
I like nerding out about that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah.
Which has massively helped in the recovery side of things, and just the joints, man. Because when I first started getting the volume in the legs in running, my joints weren't happy. So that, and then going into a squat cycle was never a fun training session. So yeah.
Nah, it's funny because it's like, so me like a lot, we talk about this a lot on our podcast and stuff like that, about knowing like your goal is and your why of what you're doing, so that you can just focus basically on like the one thing at hand. And the other day, literally Monday this week, decided to do a light strength session, just did some front squats, did some walking lunges and some other upper body stuff, but that's, I thought, real low reps, relatively low volume, and just do some work. I felt that for days. Like I could just feel like the power sapped out on the bike and everything. I just felt heavier, and I was just like, it was that reminder of just like, yeah, you can't do that, mate. Stop doing it. Just stick with your, because that's then a priority, say for me at the moment, as like with the cycling and the running. But it's definitely interesting, like where I could be improving in other areas. And I know plenty of my like clients and friends and stuff who are getting into running. Some of them are looking at now ultra marathons and stuff like that. One of my mates said to me yesterday, he's looking to do a 100-mile, like the ultra marathon in like Sheridan Forest or something like that.
Yeah.
And so it's coming up in September. And I was just like, mate, we've got a perfect guest on for you tomorrow, so you definitely should be listening to this. So yeah, let's dive into it a little bit. So something which would be quite interesting to maybe start with is maybe some of this. How do you decide? And how do you build out someone's like endurance plan? Like obviously understanding the exact like what discipline they're going in for, and maybe like their restrictions that they have.
Yeah, so I always kind of like to look at it from two approaches. There's the bottom up, which for me is kind of the physiology, and then the top down, which obviously is the results. So for example, your guy who's doing like that 100-mile ultra endurance thing, the top down result is for him to complete that and then complete that in a time that he's happy with. The bottom up thing is like, okay, what are the limiters to this? And in endurance, there's kind of like three things that dictate that. You've got your aerobic power, how much oxygen you can consume and use. You've got your anaerobic limit, basically. So when you're in that oxygen deficit, how well can you deal with it? How well can you deal with the pain? And then the third one is basically that mechanical efficiency. And so when a client comes to me, we basically do a bit of troubleshooting, a bit of chatting about stuff like that, and identify, hey, which of these three things is letting you down the most? And then we think, okay, that's going to be our priority then. And what we then do is sort of work back from the event. So it's a lot better if they've got an event, because you can work back from it and start to sort of periodize and be like, okay, early training, the intensity of your training is going to be not too high. The volume isn't going to be great. So we'll split it up into kind of those phases. And then it's like, hey, in terms of the adaptations we want to achieve, these training phases are what's going to contribute to each individual one. How do we then marry your nutrition with that? And so More often than not, the phases kind of come into 2-3 categories. So the first one will be, hey, let's pull up your aerobic power. And so from a nutrition point of view, that's all about kind of increasing aerobic enzyme activity, increasing mitochondrial biogenesis and stuff like that. And like the training that the athlete will be doing is probably going to be contributing to that. So zone 2 work, stuff like that, to really build the aerobic base. Then it's a case of, hey, what is there nutrition wise that we can do to basically amplify those adaptations? And so for that kind of early phase, it'll look like periodizing your carbs and fats to try and improve metabolic flexibility, improve your body's ability to like spare its carb storage, use that fats at low intensity, because hey, believe it or not, we've got a lot more fat stores than carb stores energy wise. So at the low intensities, if we can use that, fantastic. And you're never going to use all of that, which is why kind of like the ketogenic diet is not good for endurance performance. But using some concepts around that and improving that metabolic flexibility, if you do that in the early stages, fantastic, ace, we're building the base. Then we move more towards kind of building the ceiling, looking at basically just, okay, this is how much energy it's going to cost. How do we make sure that you have that energy in glycogen, in glucose as you're running throughout the whole thing? And so we'll do a bunch of different things in terms of like training the gut to make sure that you can actually digest what you're eating as you're running, because I can't remember who said it once. It's an awesome quote about endurance events being like, hey, they're basically eating competitions with a little bit of running thrown in.
I love that. I've been enjoying it on the bike, the fact that I can do a sport where I can eat. And for me, I'm a big fan of eating. So it's been absolutely amazing. But I've definitely found that the problem a lot of the time, especially if you're taking in a lot of like these gels and stuff like that, which I try to not steer away from, but I try to limit, because it's just the way it plays havoc with your guts essentially, because it's just so refined and just uncomfortable. So obviously but then on the flip side, you don't want anything too, like you have to think about digesting too much. Otherwise, it's just you're taking blood away from where you need it, if you know what I mean. So it's in like, so what are some of the strategies that you suggest to people?
Man, so with training the gut, so at PH, we've got a fantastic coach called Patricia, who's like a gut specialist. She knows a lot about that. So I definitely recommend checking out some of her stuff in that. But in terms of training the gut as you go, it's basically treating it like any muscle sort of thing. So like me and Liam have talked a lot about adaptive versus performance sessions, and kind of in the sort of competition phase of training where intensity's up, like I would strongly recommend some athletes that I'm working with to be like, hey, this session, I want you to basically just test and try and see what works in terms of carbs getting into your body. So we want to find something that you're happy with, that you're confident with, and that isn't going to play havoc on your gut. And the more you kind of do it, the more your gut adapts, because it will adapt. And we always throw this other phrase out about how optimal isn't practical, because the kind of some of the optimal recommendations for carbohydrate like ingestion whilst you're in the middle of an endurance event is like 60 grams of carbs per hour, if not more, 90 grams of carbs per hour. And like that is a lot of carbohydrate, normally, as you say, in that kind of like refined form. And so we tend to say like, hey, optimal isn't practical. Are you able to get this in? Probably. Will it make you poo yourself? Hey, maybe. If so, let's dial it back a little. Let's see kind of what works for you in terms of the practical side of things. So taking, what we know in the literature and then applying it to each individual athlete and what their gut can actually handle, and what we know it can handle from training and from repeating these kind of strategies that we're laying out. I think that's a key one. Another one is basically switching up the type of carbs that you're using as well to speed up that transport. So instead of just pure glucose, you can get gels which are semi-glucose, semi-fructose, which improves rate of absorption, which then means, hey, you maybe don't need as much, which means it plays a little less havoc on the gut, that kind of things, just other kind of little tactics there. But for me, I think the main thing with that when you're actually in the event is just making sure that you've done it before. Don't do anything in an event that you haven't practiced before and that you aren't confident is going to, see you through.
Absolutely. That's awesome. One thing before we move on, Lou, I want to go back to the metabolic flexibility point, because it's something I'm very interested in. And what are some practical strategies that the listeners can apply for improving their fat oxidation? And dig into that a little bit more for us, please.
Okay, yeah. So there's a couple. One that I'm doing at the minute, just because I'm in kind of the perfect situation to do it, which I'm sure many people are in terms of being locked in your house, is this idea of intermittent fasting. So whenever you say that word, you kind of need to throw some caveats out, because people think it's a holy grail and everyone should do intermittent fasting. I don't. I think intermittent fasting is a very useful tool for certain situations. We know that, it's not necessarily going to improve your body composition when everything's matched, but from the metabolic flexibility side of things, if there's a little bit of data out there to kind of show that, eating in a 16-hour fast, 8-hour eating window kind of way can improve your kind of respiratory exchange ratio, which is this metric of basically what your body's using. Is it fat or is it carbs as a substrate? So that's something that I've been doing with a 16-hour fast, 8-hour window. And I'm lucky enough that I can use kind of some of the testing equipment that I have to sort of actually quantify it. So although the evidence is sort of a little bit weak in terms of if it works, but there is some suggested. For me, I can now look at it and say hey, at the start of this 8 weeks of intermittent fasting that I did, my respiratory exchange ratio was 0.75, which is what it was. I did another test kind of 4 weeks in, so halfway through. I'm in about week 6 now, and it was down to 0.72. And obviously they're just kind of one-off tests, but to me it's kind of hey, there's some potential to that this is working. So that kind of 16-hour fast, 8-hour feeding window could work for me. That looks like first meal at 12, last meal at 8 p.m. at night.
Yeah, so I do as well.
Yeah, there we go.
So just for the listeners' benefit, respiratory exchange ratio, as it drops, that means you use more fat for fuel.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah. So for most people, it's going to be anywhere between 0.7 and 1. Closer it is to 1, the more carbs you're using. If it's above 1, that means you're anaerobic. 0.7 is fats. If it's below 0.7, that means you're kind of almost in ketosis and fully fat adapted there, which isn't necessarily a good thing. It could be in some cases. It's always worth putting kind of the context warning out there for that sort of stuff. But yeah, anywhere between kind of 0.7 and 1 normally. Closer to 0.7, the more fats are being used as a fuel as opposed to carbs.
I definitely think as for the listeners to take away, and if they are interested, obviously, in dabbling into the world of intermittent fasting if they've never done it before, and even just being more conscious about when you're stopping eating. So maybe starting with a 12-12 and having that conscious way, because it's even though I've done intermittent fasting many times before, and I really like it, but whenever I try and restart and kind of get back into it, I always struggle. But recently, it's really weird. It's literally this week, I've just started doing it again, and it was just I just missed breakfast one morning because I had a busy morning with clients, and I was like, do you know what? I actually feel all right. I then did have a flat white, which obviously then breaks the fast anyway, but I had that about towards 12 o'clock, and I was like, I feel okay. And then today, just back in it again, and then I'm just it's starting to feel good again. And I was just like, do you know what? And it was because I was telling another client, because he was asking about intermittent fasting and stuff. I said that, it can be quite a struggle. So try not giving yourself necessarily that structure of 16-8 at the start, and say, just maybe stop eating at 8. And then if you need to start eating, just take note of when you start eating, and then building up upon that. But so you touched on it kind of a little bit there in regards to testing. So what does that mean? What are you testing?
Oh man, yeah. So I've got a couple of bits of kit. So when I was at uni, this kind of kit was dusty old lab stuff, and it was basically breathing into a bag. But what you're kind of looking at, what I look at with the kit that I have here is basically oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production. So it's like a breath analysis, and the ratio of those tells me basically what's my body using, because we respire aerobically using oxygen, and the kind of, as I've sort of said there, the ratio of oxygen that we consume compared to carbon dioxide we produce, depending on the type of respiration that occurs, gives us an indicator of, hey, what you're using as a fuel. So for me, it's basically I strap on a mask in the morning and I lie on my bed for 10 minutes, and that takes my resting metabolic rate. So an estimation of how many calories I'm burning at that point in time. Important to say at that point in time, because obviously it changes throughout the day. And then, where that kind of fuel's coming on, depending on that ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide. So that's kind of one of the bits of kit that I use. And then I've got another one that I love, which is called a Moxie, which is a muscle oxygen sensor. So that's less for kind of the at rest and metabolic rate stuff, and more for the actual kind of like exercise testing and looking at exercise capacity and limiting factors there and stuff like that. So
that's awesome. One question I'm sure listeners will have on the fasting point, just before we move on, because this is my particular area of interest, I guess, is if you're training your metabolic flexibility to improve your ability to burn fat for performance, that's very useful, especially for the low intensity stuff. However, does that mean it'll be easier for you to maintain a leaner body composition because your body is more happy to dip into its fat stores?
It's one of those where not necessarily. So that kind of body composition equation, there's so many factors that feed into that. And we know that kind of the most important one is just energy balance, right? So if you're carrying out intermittent fasting, but you're still consuming significantly more calories than you're expending, then hey, that body composition is probably going to start to go in the wrong direction. And it's one of those where like I find that more of the psychological aspect and the adherence aspect of it is potentially more of a contributing factor in terms of ease of maintenance of a certain body composition. Like once you kind of get into the habit of it, as Rob kind of alluded to there, like once you start doing it, it gets a lot easier to do. And lo and behold, 8 hours is not much time to get a lot of calories in or that sort of thing. So it's one of those where you can sort of think about it kind of like the ketogenic diet, I guess, when you're using the fat oxidation example. People do the ketogenic diet and they say, look at how much fat I'm burning. And it's like, yeah, but you're putting a lot of fat in there. So your body's like a car. If you put petrol, it's going to use petrol. If you put fat in it, it's going to use fat. Does that translate to body fat? No, because you're probably putting more than enough dietary fat in there. So it's about that and thinking about kind of the big picture still and the concept of energy balance. And obviously we know that protein is so important in body composition and that sort of thing. So I think that's my view on it. Obviously, Ash, you might have
I completely agree. I think that's exactly in line with what I think. I think the adherence and to the calorie balance is the key point and what makes it work for your lifestyle. I just think that it's like a lot of people would have that thought that I'm teaching my body to be better at burning fat. So if I go into a phase where I want to burn fat off, will my body do it more effectively than if I'm switching my substrate more often? I think that's just a common train of thought. And it's, like you say, only a very small part of the equation compared to the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think it's one of those as well that kind of feeds into the endurance side of things where we've seen that, we've got this concept of, hey, if I can get my body to burn loads of fat and use my fat stores, then ace, I've got loads of energy there. I'm going to be fantastic for an event. And so you see people doing the ketogenic diet and thinking that's going to really, really see them through in an event. But it turns out that, hey, the limiting factor there to their performance more often than not is still kind of glycogen stores, so carb stores. So that's why I kind of like to look at it from the endurance perspective, is taking those concepts, but then almost breaking it into phases. So like that first phase would be, hey, let's improve that metabolic flexibility, improve our ability at using fats at low intensities so that we can spare glycogen. And then that second phase is basically, hey, now that we're good at sparing glycogen, let's make sure those fuel stores are as big as they can be and that we can use it efficiently when we get there. Because there's this idea or this theory that where you kind of improve on your fat efficiency usage, you kind of stop being able to access the carb as much. And there's that kind of theory floating out there where like, hey, if you become fully fat adapted, does that compromise your anaerobic power and your carb usage? So it's that kind of balance. And using the concepts and plotting them out like that is the way that I like to see it.
Is that related to the train low, race high type strategy?
Train high, there we go. That's a good one.
Yeah. So would you say that's a common sort of pitfall, is that people train too low so that they actually don't have the capacity to compete to their max because they haven't trained those glycogen stores to be as big as possible?
Yeah. I was doing a bit of a a bit of a literature review recently on basically the ketogenic diet and performance, because someone asked me about it, and I was chatting to one of the leading researchers, and a guy called Fionn McSwiney from Ireland. He's a very, very knowledgeable dude. He's done a load of research in the ketogenic diet and endurance performance, and he did a review article a year ago, and it basically said like they were looking at a ton of research on the ketogenic diet and different events, and all of it basically said at low to moderate intensities there was no real difference, like whether you were ketogenic or, you know, a carbohydrate based diet. But at higher intensities, so at like 80% plus of your VO2 max, it was almost like the ketogenic diet sort of lost that fifth gear. And there was a dip in performance for those studies that they saw. So it's one of those where like, hey, there doesn't seem to be any real benefit to go in full fat max for the low stuff. Like you're about the same as the carb stuff, but you also lose that sort of fifth gear. So if you can, you know, harness the concepts and still keep that fifth gear and make sure that that fifth gear is ready to go come race day, come event day, then you should be sitting pretty in quite a good spot.
So just on that, would you say that if obviously it becomes then like discipline dependent, like obviously, so for instance, if you're going to do an Ironman or something like that, where it's obviously, or like an ultra endurance like marathon, where you're not looking to essentially get into that fifth gear, so you're going to stay in gears 1 to 4, say. So as you're going along, it seems there's no real difference. I guess it would then boil down to what you feel better like eating to just get that fuel. Because if you're someone that prefers fattier foods and because of the higher caloric load, so you're taking in less volume because you don't necessarily have the size. So for instance, I have no issue eating anything. And I can eat a lot of it. Whereas I know my friend who's about to do the ultra marathon, he doesn't really like to eat. He sees food as like a fuel source and doesn't have that same drive. So maybe for someone like him, he'd be better having higher fat foods where you're not ingesting as much, because he doesn't need that fifth gear of like that you need to utilize the carbohydrates.
Yeah, I think in terms of the what's being used as well as intensity, duration has an effect as well, right? So those very, very long events, like you're always going to be using a combination of both. And although majority kind of fat, if that's what they've been fueling their body, if the intensity is relatively low, like as the time goes on, that relative intensity is going to start to creep up as you become more and more fatigued, right? As muscular occurs, there's still going to be the need for glycogen stores to come into effect and carb stores to be used. So it's one of those where it's finding, hey, what is most practical for this athlete, and then also let's make sure that you've still got carb stores there. Just because that is kind of what we've seen from like time to exhaustion at Common. So it's a method of kind of carrying out these studies that is used quite a lot. Is these basically time to exhaustion trials, where you basically sit someone or stand someone on a treadmill and say, hey, it's set at this speed, keep going till you fatigue, basically. And those studies again have found that, hey, the dependence on time to exhaustion like is still kind of carb dominated and dependent on glycogen stores and stuff like that. So I think that there needs to be a bit more kind of research looking into exactly this. And that's kind of been some of the issues with the ketogenic diet stuff, is people saying, hey, they haven't been in ketosis for so long, they haven't been fat adapted for so long, or the event wasn't long enough to kind of see the effects. So it's one of those where you still need to kind of cover all the bases. But going off what we know now, I would still say that carbs are king in this.
Are there actually people who would have fats during ultra events? Like what sort of snacks? Because all the products that you have intra workout are very much carbs, right?
Yeah.
And I can't imagine like sucking down some coconut oil or something while you're doing
eating some peanut butter and stuff like that. But
people do that?
For me, it's just, well, I don't know. That's why I'm asking. It's just like, because I've never looked into like that. I've never looked into the ultra endurance world, and it's just like, surely, because when he told me there was a time cap of like 30 hours on this thing, right? So in my head, I'm like, cool, okay, so hopefully they're wanting people to say 24 hours, right, of just constant moving. So for me, I'm just like, taking in that much food is in like, that must be challenging. There's obviously fuel stations along the way and stuff, but it's in, I know when it comes to that, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, but it's in like, when we come to like these longer events, nutrition does play quite a big part into obviously to help you keep moving along the way. So for me, I'm just thinking, right, if I'm struggling to get in calories, surely then getting in fats, like say like nuttable, like, you know, nut balls and stuff like that, like those type of things, would they not benefit you because you're taking in less for the digestion?
But then the digestion of fats is a little bit harder than the digestion of carbs though as well. So in terms of that, like although the energy like punch is a bit bigger in fats, you've got the knock-on effect of almost
hard to digest and
digestion. Yeah. So simple sugars are still king for that. And I remember like looking at the literature, it's always like, hey, for carb loading, you want 10 grams of carbs per kilo body weight for the 24 hours leading up, and 60 to 90 grams per hour for anything longer than 3 hours, which you look at it and you think, geez, that's a lot. But then if you kind of equate that to energy, it's still going to be a lot in the form of fats. You're not going to be able to access that energy as fast.
No.
And it's potentially going to put a bit more of a strain on your gut anyway. So the simple sugars, the simple carbs for during, I still think they're king.
Nice. It's more just because this is such a new world to me. That is, I do not know what other people do because I haven't had that chance. So this is why I kind of really want to get out today as well, to kind of, because this is now a bit of a journey for me. So what can I kind of learn as well from someone that's obviously been dealing with people doing this type of stuff. Now, just since you mentioned about with CrossFit as well. Now, have you seen that there's been a big difference with the nutrition? Because obviously now we're talking a lot about, say, the endurance bits, but how have you found dealing with, say, CrossFit athletes and their nutrition? Has there been any like easy carryovers and so forth?
Yeah, surprisingly so. Like in terms of gaps to fill. So for the most part, out of athletes that I've tested that are in the CrossFit world and at the games and kind of sanctionals level, the gaps to fill have always been, hey, like you could be potentially more efficient at using fats as a fuel. But when you take that over to the sport, it's a case of, yeah, you probably could, but does that work for CrossFit? Because majority of CrossFit, until you get to kind of game sanctionals level, it's always going to be that kind of 5 to 20 minute time domain of high intensity competition stuff. So in terms of that, like, is there any benefit to improving that or not? And more often than not, it's probably not. It's still something that with the guys that kind of go to the games that we practice in the very early stages of prep, just so that should a marathon row or anything like that come up, that there's still got that kind of aspect of their bases covered. But around competition, we still very much kind of support carbs and stuff like that. So in terms of the transition for actual in-event stuff, there is, when you think about carb ingestion and all that sort of stuff, it's a lot more practical as well in terms of what we're trying to get in for each event, because chances are they're not going to totally use all their stored carbs in a CrossFit event. So do we have to worry about getting 10 grams of carbs in per kilo body weight, which for one of my guys is literally a kilo of carbs the day before? Probably not. We probably don't need to worry about that, which means that you don't have to sit eating pasta literally all day the day before, and that sort of thing. So it's one of those where, to me, that's kind of why, as I mentioned earlier, the ultra endurance side of things is a little bit more fascinating to me, because there are problems that come with trying to get that much fuel in. How do we work around them? How do we apply it to the practical worlds? Whereas from the CrossFit side of things, it's one of those where it's quite easy to get those concepts across, because it's not as sort of dramatic in terms of fuel needs and energy needs for the actual event itself.
That's cool. One question I had about that, building the base of fat metabolism, again, keep going back to that, but how long do you think would you typically allow to go into that sort of glycogen building phase? So after you've done your fasting and other strategies to help improve fat metabolism, you say you do it like in their off season, quite far away from competition. What's a good rule of thumb for a phase to really optimize that glycogen storage and usage?
So the phase that I kind of roll with for that is, it tends to be kind of 4 to 6 weeks ultimately in that, and maybe a bit kind of less if the event's a bit shorter. So just because it's one of those where there may be that kind of payoff where, hey, once you start feeding people with carbs again, are they going to lose that metabolic flexibility, and what is the time scale there? And ultimately, I don't know the exact time scale, and it's about using kind of the principles and making sure that, you know, you're testing throughout the way and making sure that, hey, we're still on the right track. But for me, more often than not, it tends to be about sort of 4 weeks there for that phase, a bit longer if they almost like have a confidence issue, because I've dealt with some kind of athletes before that, you know, will start getting this buy-in for this first phase where, don't get me wrong, you're not totally low carb, you're just switching and periodizing, and you might be doing some training low, but it might be a little less carbs than they're used to. And so for those, they almost have this ingrained psychological idea of, I need carbohydrates to perform. So if they kind of go a month where they've been fueled with carbs, that may not necessarily still be enough for them to think, yeah, I'm used to this and I'm ready to go. So it might be, okay, let's make it a little bit longer, because I think that the psychological aspect of it cannot sort of be understated. So even though there may not be any changes in those 2 weeks, between 4 weeks and 6 weeks of actual capacity and how much you can store and that sort of thing, I think in terms of their mental game, it might improve a little, which is definitely not something that you can overlook there. So totally depends on the athlete, but let's say 4 to 6 weeks is a rule of thumb.
Brilliant. That's cool. And would you, when you continue the testing throughout, is that the ratio, and would you expect it to stay about the same in that 4 to 6 weeks during rest, as in they continue to use the same proportion of fat in the morning when they do that breathing test in bed?
It starts to creep up a little bit, but it's one of those where if it's by kind of like 0.2 or whatever, so to use like ideal numbers, when we start that phase, it'd be 0.7. And then when we finish that phase, in my mind, I'm thinking, and this is again just kind of a rule of thumb depending on the athlete and where they're at before and all that sort of thing. But if there's kind of like a 0.2 or 0.5 change, then cool. Anywhere beneath that, happy days, fantastic. Try and sort of keep it there. But it's not the end of the world if it goes above. It's just kind of one of those learning curves where you're like, okay, we still know that their carb stores are maximized. We still know that they're probably going to perform better than if they were just given fat as a fuel. And now we can kind of know and work back for the next time and for the next kind of timeline. Because, I mean, as much as you can plan for stuff like this, it's all about making changes on the fly, depending on, you know, the results you're given in terms of what they're performing. For me, stuff that we find from the testing and just how they're feeling in terms of the feedback there. It's always going to change slightly, even if you can map out the exact plan, and maybe not even slightly. Like, that's the beautiful thing about it, I guess, is adapt basically. So not just these physiological adaptations, but for me to adapt as a practitioner based on what's happening in front of me with this athlete, and thinking, hey, what is going to be the best thing for you? And that cost benefit between the psychological aspect, the physiological aspect. If we were to, so if you came to me and said, hey, I'm doing an Ironman in 4 weeks, I would say, cool, let's give you a load of carbs. Skip that first phase, not going to be worth it. Load of carbs going in, and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Awesome. That's really cool.
Nice. So apart from hiring you as a coach to deal with their nutrition, when it comes to building up your own endurance, like nutrition plan, is there any like key, like foundational points that you make sure you kind of work with? Like, we've kind of touched on durations as well. Like, would you be able to kind of maybe dive a bit deeper into, if someone wants to set up their own endurance nutrition plan, what are some of the key things to maybe think about and plan out for?
Nice. Yeah. So we'll kind of go down the classic nutrition pyramid route and break it up bit by bit, right? So first thing, you've got calories, right? And some very important thing about endurance nutrition is not underestimating the energy cost, because it costs a lot of energy to train endurance wise. And if you're in a caloric deficit, your energy availability is going to be low and you're not going to perform as well. So first things first, making sure you're getting enough energy in. And that can come from, you know, sort of tracking your weight. If it starts to go down, hey, you need more food. Obviously, there's an aspect of mechanical efficiency there. So if you were actively kind of wanting to lose weight in the first part to improve your efficiency, ace. But then once you get to a point where you want to maintain and you want to focus at that weight, making sure that, you know, you're getting enough calories in for sure. Then on the macro side of thing, let's tackle protein first, because that surprisingly is the easiest one to tackle in endurance. It's one of those where you probably don't need as much as if you were doing resistance training. So for me, when I first kind of got into endurance training, my protein before was at kind of like 2 grams per kilo body weight, which is a relatively like normal common recommendation for muscle protein synthesis, building muscle mass, and all the good stuff. Endurance wise, it was kind of like I was thinking, okay, do I necessarily want to build more muscle? No. Do I want to maintain the muscle that I have so that I'm more efficient? Yeah, sweet, cool. Do I want to make sure that I'm getting energy from sources that my body uses better as opposed to protein? Yes, I do. Cool. I'm going to take that protein down. And kind of the numbers there are sort of like 1.2 to 1.6 for me, just because habitually I'm used to consuming more protein. I went to that kind of high limit of 1.6 grams per kilo body weight per day. And then that was like basically set. And then in that kind of first phase, with what's left of calories, once protein's kind of dealt with, it was like, hey, sweet, I'm going to obviously switch it up day to day, depending on the type of training I'm doing. So as we've talked about, I'm doing some resistance training still. And I will mix it day to day. I won't do resistance and endurance on the same day. Obviously you can with like the right time in between and that sort of stuff, but I won't. So for me, it's like, cool, resistance training, I'm gonna have a bit more carbs. Endurance training, I'll probably have a bit less fat that day. And in that kind of early phase, I might start doing some training low, so training fasted if I'm doing my low intensity zone 2 stuff. But as kind of like a rule of thumb in terms of numbers, we're actually laying some out in a endurance program that we're going to put out soon. But it's one of those where, okay, early phase for endurance stuff, a little bit more fat, a little bit less carbs. Then as you get closer to that event, kind of 4 weeks, 6 weeks out, switch it around, start taking that carb up. And there's some recommendations again of kind of like 5 grams per kilo body weight of carbs. But just thinking about, hey, is that going to be optimal for me? If not, just take it up gradually throughout that sort of 4 weeks. Just take it up. Fat will come at a cost there, rolling with that. So in terms of the macros thing, that's kind of like a good base to get started. There's actually going to be a blog that I've written just this week covering basically all of that will be up on the PH Nutrition website within the next couple of weeks. So
awesome.
That'll be for the macros. And then there's stuff on the micronutrient side of things as well that is super key. So we want to like make sure that like aerobic respiration is happening. And so there's things that can improve that. There's things that can inhibit that. And so one key thing is obviously oxygen supply to the muscle. So make sure you're getting enough iron in. Nitrates literally make the mitochondria more efficient at producing energy per oxygen molecule. So make sure you're getting iron in with red meat, spinach, make sure it's being absorbed well with vitamin C. So that's a really good kind of tip there, is like vitamin C enhances iron absorption. So for me, I'll have like an iron absorption smoothie where I'll just chuck everything in there. So spinach, berries with the vitamins, red meat, smoothie, blitz it all up, and then I'll throw some beetroot powder in as well for the nitrates, and then it's kind of like done in one go. Don't have to worry about it for the rest of the day. Obviously, like my food will still be nutritious, still get a load of colors in and stuff like that. But yeah, those are kind of some key nutrients there for sure.
That's awesome. Other than the ultra endurance stuff, what else are you particularly excited about in the world of nutrition? I saw you put up a cool video about caffeine metabolism. Is that an area of interest?
Yeah. I mean, I love caffeine, first of all. Yeah. Coffee, especially, I'm a huge fan of. I used to work in a coffee shop when I was at uni. But the kind of thing that caught my eye there was this idea of kind of like your response to caffeine based on your genotype. Which, when you say that again, it's kind of like intermittent fasting or the ketogenic diet, alarm bells might start to ring. So for me, it's kind of looking at, okay, what is the evidence behind our body's response to certain nutrients based on the genotype of genes that kind of code for that? And so at the moment, it's kind of one of those where it's like, yeah, you probably shouldn't worry about it, especially with caffeine. So that kind of paper that you were talking about there, the post that I put up, was basically, they were looking at how well your body responds to caffeine based on the type of gene that you have. And so the genes they were looking at were genes that were involved in metabolizing caffeine, so breaking it down, and then genes involved in adenosine receptors. So the way that caffeine works, for one of its kind of methods of action, is it blocks these adenosine receptors, which makes you feel more awake. And so they were looking at like, hey, if there are different genes for these different alleles, different genotypes for these different genes that metabolize caffeine, that code for adenosine receptors, so they'll bring about, slightly different properties in each person. Someone might be able to metabolize caffeine better if they have a different genotype to someone else. Does that actually affect the outcome of kind of these caffeine benefits that we see? And the takeaway was no. doesn't matter. So drink your coffee. But it's that kind of stuff where, it seems sort of interesting and exciting, and it is, but practically it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's amazing. Has there been any similar research around the effect of caffeine on sleep? Because I feel like if I have, me and Rob were talking about before we went on air, if I have coffee, a lot of caffeine during the day, my sleep will definitely be effective. But I've got some like friends and relatives who can have a double espresso before bed, and they claim that it has zero impact on their sleep. So could it be that the genetic component affects sleep but not performance?
Yeah, I think logically that makes total sense. And I think there are some studies out there that I haven't read. I was pointed in the direction of them actually when I put up that post, so I need to check those out. But yeah, I haven't yet read them. But I think there's definitely kind of the potential there when you think about it logically. And even with just your experience and anecdotal experience, even though that is obviously not good science, sometimes it's hard to ignore. So yeah, I'll have a dive in and I'll let you know.
I look forward to the part 2 video, mate.
There we go. Yeah.
Awesome. I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much, Luke. That was absolutely phenomenal. Like loads of really quality information there, and I think the listeners will get a lot out of it. I know we did, like just from a personal point of view. It's a great little bit of personalized question and answer. So where can everyone find out a little bit more about you, mate?
Ace, yeah. So primarily on Instagram at Hallmighty1, which is a terrible username that I came up when I was 16 that I thought was funny, and has kind of followed me into my professional career. But so yeah, at Hallmighty1, and then the PH Nutrition website, so phnutrition.co.uk. I do a ton of blogs and stuff like that on there, and that's where our coaching services are offered as well. And we're just putting together a endurance program, an engine nutrition program for that we're hoping to release within kind of a month or so, and that'll be on the PH Nutrition website as well.
Nice. Brilliant. I just wanted on that new thing you're going to be doing with PH. Could you give us a little bit more insight into that, just so the listeners can know? Because I'm sure that I'm going to be getting involved in it as well. I'd like to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. So we're basically, it's going to be a program. With regards to the time, we don't know how long. We're putting all the content together, and it depends kind of how long it ends up being. But it's essentially going to be a nutrition program designed to attack everything that we sort of talked about today. So it's going to be split into a couple of phases. So phase 1, building the base. Phase 2, raising the ceiling, and then putting it all together. And so with that, what it'll be is our nutrition plans that will be tailored. So templates tailored to yourself, and then with different targets depending on what phase you're at. And then as well as kind of walking through those programs and following the meals and the macros that we set out on those. There'll be lessons each day basically on why we're doing what we're doing, what it's going to bring about, and then kind of like bonus things on top of just your standard nutrition template. So personalized hydration protocols, how to create those, supplements for building the base, supplements for raising the ceiling, and just really taking a deep dive and guiding you through basically how I work with athletes, but a kind of self-led with the lessons, with the nutrition plan there next to you, so that you are doing it and you're following why you're doing it, which I think, I'm really excited to kind of get it out there. It's one of those where just it's hopefully going to benefit a lot of people in the area that I'm super passionate about. So, yeah.
Nice. It sounds really exciting. And for what type of person would this be appropriate for? Would it be appropriate for someone that say does wants to get better 5Ks? I know they're not necessarily long endurance, but what's your class of endurance that this would be most beneficial for?
So we're aiming it at in true classic CrossFit style. we're aiming it at people that want to improve their engine. So you've always kind of, I still don't understand why CrossFitters call it their engine, but they do. Engine to me is just capacity, so aerobic capacity, aerobic capacity. So the kind of like top-down results we want to achieve is basically improve the intensity that you can hit metcons, improve your capacity for longer duration stuff, be that CrossFit metcons, be that endurance work, basically just improving everything. And then obviously from that kind of ultra endurance side of things, like we're going to be having lessons in there that essentially tailor like, hey, this is how long you should be spending on this dependent on your goal. So if you're doing CrossFit, hey, building the base stuff, spend that on like for the 4 weeks. Fantastic, done. Now focus on the raising the ceiling, because that's potentially going to be a bit more sport specific to yourself. Do that for X amount of weeks, and then restart the process all over again, that kind of thing. So for the ultra endurance side of things, it'd be a case of, okay, cool, maybe spend a little bit longer on that first phase, and then move on to that sort of second phase. But there are going to be lessons in there that we break down, like, hey, if you're doing it for improving your CrossFit capacity and metcons, ACE, this is follow all the principles still, just in terms of time durations and attacking it. This is what's going to be most relevant for you. If you're doing it to improve your long duration ultra endurance stuff, same thing, follow all the principles. This is how long you should attack it for. This is the more relevant stuff. Have at it, that sort of stuff.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing that and all the content you're putting out to do with that. As always, guys, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this. We appreciate that. And I'll put all Luke's information down below. As always, if you did enjoy this episode, please share this with friends. Anyone else that's getting into the endurance world, I'm sure there's plenty of new people doing it now. So I think this will be a really appropriate episode. But thanks a lot for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, guys.